Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a real privilege for me to be here and to be able to share this morning. My background is actually as a baby doctor, so I've spent most of my life working with people at the other end of life, caring for some very small, fragile, tiny babies. Some of the smallest babies I cared for went down to a birth weight of 500 grams, just over a pound in weight, and literally fitting in the palm of my hand. And it's out of those experiences, really, and trying to serve as a doctor and as a Christian in some very challenging and difficult areas that I increasingly became involved in issues of medical ethics and trying to stand for the value of human life, even the most fragile, the most vulnerable, the most impaired human lives, that every human life is special. And so it's a great privilege for me to be here and to talk on this subject of what does it mean to finish well. And we're going to be looking at this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and asking the question, what can we learn from this passage about coming to the end of life? So let's just see if we could advance the next slide. Thank you. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul is drawing a comparison between the amazing miracle that happened right at creation when God says, "Let there be light." And just by the power of his word and by the Spirit, light comes, and there was light. And Paul says there's actually a comparison between that and with a smaller miracle, which is that God brings his own light into our hearts. So the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts. It's the same miracle. But it originates by the power of God. It's God who brings light into our hearts. And all of us who have the privilege of knowing the Lord Jesus, it's because of God's initiation, the power of God. So he says, make his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. So the hidden treasure that's in our hearts is, thanks very much, the hidden treasure in our hearts is the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That is the amazing thing which we who are Christians have a privilege. God's glory revealed not in the wonders of the cosmos, although his glory is revealed there, not in the amazing intricacies of science or the beauties of creativity. No, God's glory revealed above all in the man, the Lord Jesus Christ. So that is the hidden treasure that every one of us who are true believers carry. But, Paul goes on, this treasure is put, sorry, could you go on to the next slide again? This treasure is put in jars of clay. Apparently, it was quite common in the ancient world for people to hide their jewels in an earthenware pot, which just looked like a normal pot in the kitchen. Some people still do it today. Put it in a bag of flour or something like that. So this is the analogy that Paul is using. He's saying, here is this amazing treasure, but it's hidden. And it's hidden in the most unprepossessing container. It's a jar of clay. And of course, these jars of clay are our bodies, our human bodies. And yes, our bodies are wonderful, but they're also amazingly fragile, amazingly vulnerable, amazingly dependent. And you know, we often reflect about the fact that God has made us in his own image. That's what we find in Genesis 1, where God says, "Let us make human beings in our image to reflect the very character and being of God." But we don't pay as much attention to the second chapter of Genesis, where God says, makes human beings out of the dust of the earth. We are made out of dust. And did you know that in the Hebrew language, the word for human, Adam, is derived from the word for ground, Adamah. So in the literal Hebrew, to be human is to be a groundling. And did you know the same is true in English, that the word human is derived from humus? Not the nice stuff you put on pita bread, but the compost heap. We are made out of the compost heap. That's what it means to be human. And this has very profound significance because what it means is that we are designed to be weak. We're designed to be vulnerable. We're designed to be fragile. We're designed to be dependent on others. And to use a philosophical term, we're designed to be contingent, which means we're affected by chance events. You know, as I stand here talking to you, my life, my human life, hangs by a thread. It would only take a tiny little clot in one of my coronary arteries, and I would suddenly have a cardiac arrest and fall to the floor. It would only take a tiny little clot in a carotid artery going into my brain, and I would suddenly have a stroke and lose the power of speech. This is what it means to be human, that we are fragile. And you know, it's very interesting, and we must remember that this is part of creation. This is nothing to do with the fall. It's nothing to do with the entry of evil into the world. This actually comes before the fall in Genesis chapter 2. It's part of God's design. It's part of God's creation. As Paul puts it, we have the treasure in jars of clay. And it's interesting to reflect why. Why did God choose to make us so amazingly fragile, so amazingly vulnerable? Why didn't he make us strong and dynamic? I mean, there are other spiritual beings. You think about the seraphim and the cherubim. Do you remember in the vision of Isaiah's temple? And the seraphim and the cherubim are praising God. And the whole temple is shaking by the power of their voices, by their splendor. And so presumably God could have made us like that. And instead, he chooses to make us out of humus, out of the ground, fragile and vulnerable. And I wonder, if we reflect about that, why is that? Well, I think Paul is giving us the hint here. Why is it? Answer, so that the all-surpassing power should be seen to be from God and not from us, so that God's power can be revealed in our weakness, in our dependence. So one of the things this means is that we are designed to depend on other people. You know, the very fact that you are sitting there and looking reasonably together tells me that when you were born, somebody loved you. Somebody cared for you. Somebody fed you. Somebody wiped your bottom. Somebody kept you warm. Because there was absolutely nothing you could do for yourself. You were completely and utterly dependent. And then we go through a phase in our life when other people depend on us. And we care for others, and we look after other people, and we feed them, and we look after them, and sometimes we wipe their bottoms. My wife and I, we have 3 boys, and we've cared for them and looked after them, and now at long last they've left home, and you think, good grief, thank goodness, that's over. And then the phone rings, Dad, can you put £1,000 in my account, Dad? Dad, can I borrow the car for 3 months? So I think, good grief, this phase in which other people depend on us seems to go on for an awful long time. But you know, most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And this is not some terrible, evil, shameful thing. No, it's part of the creation. It's part of the design. It's part of what God has made us for. And this was brought home to me very forcefully when my lovely mother, who was a very vivacious and active Christian lady, very active in nursery school education. She'd started her own nursery. And then she was sadly struck down by a progressive form of dementia. And before our eyes, she was transformed. And she became utterly and totally dependent. She was confused. She was hallucinating. She was locked in a body that she could do nothing for herself. She was having 24-hour nursing care. And near the end, I was visiting her, and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand. And I was saying, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth. And then I suddenly had a flashback. This was precisely what she used to do for me. This was how she cared for me. In fact, I could even think I could remember the spoon coming and the finger wiping my mouth and so on. And now the tables were turned. And I remember thinking, deep down in my spirit, this is the way it was meant to be. Because I was learning more of what it meant to be a son, and she was learning more of what it meant to be a mother. Because dependence is part of the story. It's part of what God has given us. And I hear a lot of older people, and maybe there are people in this room, who just say something like, I'm very happy to care for other people, I'm very happy to look after other people, but I don't want to be a burden. I never want to be a burden to other people. I never want to have other people have to care for me. And if I ever become a burden to other people, I'm going to say to the God, thank you very much, I've had my life, it's time to go to heaven now, goodbye. But if somebody ever says that to you, I just don't want to be a burden, or if you're ever tempted to think it yourself, you should push back and say, you are wrong. You are designed to be a burden to me, and I am designed to be a burden to you. And the life that God has given to us is one of mutual burdensomeness. And that's why Paul says, bear one another's burdens, and you will fulfill the law of Christ. And in the secular world, I think this is particularly important. This is one of the countercultural messages of the gospel in the 21st century. Because in the world where I spend a lot of time, in the world of medical ethics, it's all about what they call autonomy. My rights, my choice, I live it my way, I have total control over my body, I do whatever I like. And dependence is seen as a terrible, dehumanizing thing. But in the Christian gospel, this is part of the idea is that God's glory should be revealed in our dependence and through our dependence. And that is such a countercultural, such a wonderful but difficult message. And I don't want to make it sound easy. It's actually very challenging and difficult, isn't it, to discover our own dependence. In the limited experience I've had of severe illness, I know how difficult it is to allow other people to look after us and to see the difficulties that we're creating for other people. That's not easy. But there's an even more profound miracle, and that is that God himself, in the person of Jesus, has experienced what it means to be dependent. So the God of total power and authority, he turns himself into one of these humble, pathetic, fragile, vulnerable, dependent beings, into a human being. And he is born as a baby. And he needs to have his bottom wiped. He needs to be washed. He needs to be fed. He needs to be cared for. He is utterly and totally dependent. And at the end of his life on earth, on the cross, the God of total power and authority is stretched out on the cross, and through parched lips he says, I am thirsty. And he can do nothing for himself. He has chosen to make himself dependent. And yet, what the Christian gospel teaches us is that at that moment of total dependence and vulnerability, he is still the second person of the Trinity, upholding the universe by the word of his power. So his divine status, his divine dignity, is in no way touched by his dependence. And it's exactly the same for us too. The value of your life, the significance, the meaning, the purpose of your life is in no way touched by the fact that you may become totally dependent on the love and care of others. You will still be the the person that God knows and loves. And that glory, the wonderful treasure, will still be there in the jars of clay. And so as we go back to our passage, this is what Paul says. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair. Next slide. Persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. That's a very strong statement, isn't it? We carry around in our body the death of Jesus. And that means sometimes the scars, the wounds, the brokenness. This is about sin and all that sin did for us and led to the cross. And Paul says if we are followers of Christ, then we also carry in our own body some of those marks. We participate in the death of Christ. But why? So that the resurrection life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. And therefore, says Paul, next slide, we don't lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Glory is not an insubstantial, fragile thing. It's very interesting that in the Hebrew, the word for glory, it also means weighty. It means heavy. And that's why Paul is saying that, yes, we do have troubles here, but in comparison in what is to become, they are light. In other words, compared to the heaviness of the coming glory. And they are transient, momentary, short-lived, compared to the eternity, the ages of glory, which is waiting for us. And so we fix our eyes, says Paul, next slide, on what is not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. But since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So with those eyes fixed on the future, that's what Paul is calling us to do. It's very easy, isn't it, for us as we get to the in the older age group to become so preoccupied with our bodies, which keep on going wrong, and all the things that are going wrong. It's so easy to find ourselves preoccupied with this physical decaying form. And what Paul is challenging us is to fix our eyes not on the temporary, but on the future, on the glory that is to become, on the unseen glory. Next slide. Very recently we had the London Marathon, and the watching photographers and media were transfixed by this lady, Hayley Carruthers, who had been powering away. She was an elite runner. She'd be doing so well. And then as she came towards the finishing line, she suddenly stumbled. And she was here just crawling desperate to get over the line. But I just was very struck by this image and by the eyes that were just looking. She had to get over the line. Whatever had happened to her body, she was going to get over the line. And that's some kind of image, isn't it, of determination, of a refusal to let the declining physical strength. She was going to finish well. Next slide. So finishing well is an opportunity. In fact, there are many opportunities which come to us at the end of our life. And one of them is for internal growth. Isn't it a paradox that it's precisely when our external bodies are decaying that there is the greatest opportunity for internal growth? Learning to see beyond the superficial and to recognize what really matters, what's really beautiful, the spiritual reality. And it's something, as a medic, I've seen many times, have the privilege to watch. From the outside, it seems as though this person's body is just a wreck. That everything is going wrong and it's just decaying and going down. But actually, there's a wonderful beauty that shines out, if you've only got eyes to see it, that shines through this degenerating human body. A friend of mine, Rico Tice at All Souls Church, was visiting an elderly lady who'd been a member of the church for many years, and she'd become sick and was critically ill, and she was in hospital. She'd been there for several weeks, and she was approaching death. And Rico was visiting her in the hospital. He went up to the reception desk on the ward, and he gave her name. And the nurse there looked slightly blank, and then she said, "Oh, you mean Gabby. We all call her the angel Gabriel because she shines." Isn't that an amazing thing that something that the nurses could see? There was something about this lady. There was something about the spiritual life within her, even though her body was decaying and declining. Next slide. Finishing well is also an opportunity for healing and building and celebrating and completing relationships. It's one of the interesting things that as people come to the end of their life, they often have a kind of relational authority. They have a possibility of intervening in relationships. It's a strange thing, but as you're approaching the end of your life, you have the right to say to somebody else, "I really think we need to talk about this," or "I'd really like to see my son or my daughter, or haven't seen for 10 years. I'd really like to see the grandchildren. I'd really like to see my friend." You have the opportunity of actually mending relationships that are broken. And I've seen this, again, happen on a whole number of occasions. A friend of mine, quite a young man, was struck down by a form of cancer, and he had chemotherapy. He improved, and then unfortunately the cancer came back and was spreading through his life, through his body, and the doctors were talking about using some new kind of experimental treatment, and I was sitting having a cup of coffee with him, and I sensed that he was much closer to death than he realized, and I said to him, "If I could give you 3 months of life, of really functional, useful life, and then you were to die, what would you do with those 3 months?" And I was expecting him, he was an academic, a bit of a nerdy sort of type, he was doing a PhD. I was expecting him to say, "I'd really like to finish my PhD," or "I've got this paper I need to write," or something like that. "I need this book I need to read." But what he actually said was, "Do you know, if I knew that I only had 3 months left, what I'd do is I'd stop all my studies, I'd stop everything else, and what I'd do is I'd want to write a letter to everybody I've ever known in my life, and I'd want to share with them what's happening to me, and share with them my hope of eternal life." And that's exactly what happened. He stopped having all kinds of treatment, he was just having pain relief and palliative care, and he started writing letters. This was a number of years ago, so it was before the age of email, and he got out his address book, and he started at A, and he started going through his address book and handwriting letters. And he wrote hundreds of letters in those last 3 months. And his life through those letters had a most astonishing impact. When he passed away, quite gently at home, after it was literally about 3 months, over 400 people came to a Thanksgiving service, and many of them were there just because they'd received a letter. And it was a real privilege for me to see that and to be part of it. And I remember sitting in that service thinking, I'm quite envious of Stuart. I mean, many people don't die like that. Many people don't have the opportunity of really strengthening and celebrating and using the relationships that God has given us. So maybe that's something we need to think about. Maybe as we're coming to the end of our lives, how can I celebrate, build, but maybe mend or even complete relationships? I mean, there's a sense in which we can never complete relationships. Of course, our relationships are going to go on into glory as we become part of the new heaven and the new earth. But I think it's very important that we don't die with unfinished business. If there is unfinished business in your life, if there's unfinished business in relationships, then here is the opportunity. Here is the opportunity to put things right. Here is the opportunity to mend and complete relationships. Next slide. Okay, thanks very much. I'll try this one. In order to finish well, I have to be at peace with God and at peace with the most important people in my life. A dying person is able to bless his or her loved ones by, as I've said, mending, celebrating, and strengthening the most significant relationships at the end of life. Finishing well is an opportunity for finding forgiveness. You know, for many people, as they come to the end of their lives, they actually carry within them deep feelings of guilt, feelings of brokenness, feelings of failure. And there is an amazing opportunity as people come to the end of their lives for finding forgiveness. A friend of mine, she used to describe her mother as an intensely angry woman. She was a very difficult lady. She had a very bitter tongue. She was very critical, destructive. And my friend, her daughter, had found faith at university, and she'd frequently spoken to her mother about Christ and tried to share with her. But her mother had just always repelled it and had wanted nothing to do with it. And then she was diagnosed with an advanced form of cancer. And this lady was sitting with her daughter in the outpatient department of a radiotherapy department in the hospital. And they were just sitting in the waiting area. And you know what it's like in a hospital department, and there's all these people coming to and fro, and bleeps going off, and complete mayhem. And her mother turns to her daughter and says, "I've just got 3 things to ask you. 1, how can I be forgiven? 2, how can I forgive? And 3, what happens when I die?" And her daughter said, sitting in the outpatient department with all this hubbub going along, they had this amazingly intense but wonderful conversation. It turned out that her mother had been abused as a child, both physically and sexually. She'd never spoken about it, but that was really the explanation for all her bitterness and her anger and her difficulties. And that was why the question was, how can I forgive? How can I forgiveness? And then how can I be forgiven? And her daughter just shared with her about the gospel. And there in the outpatient department, something happened. And this daughter said, "My mother was completely remade in the last 2 weeks of her life. I've never seen anything so radical," she said. And she was admitted into a terminal care ward. And she was filled with gratitude. She seemed to have a sort of personality change. She was saying, "Oh, I'm so grateful meeting my grandchildren and being able to pray with them. And thank you so much for these pureed vegetables." and the nurses were saying, what an amazing lady. We love looking after her. And in fact, she died literally about 2 to 3 weeks after that conversation, with her daughter holding her hand, reading from the Psalms, and singing Christian songs to her. And after she died, the nurses came into the room, and the daughter was there. She said, literally with the body of her mother on the bed. And the nurses came and said, "This was such a wonderful lady. We just so loved looking after her. She was so gentle, so grateful, so kind." And there, she said, in the room with the body of her mother, she was able to share about the gospel and about the power of forgiveness and the way that the Spirit can change people. And so this opportunity for forgiveness only came because of the cancer. It was that triggered this whole amazing adventure. So finishing well is an opportunity for finding forgiveness. And again, can I gently challenge you, if there are things deep in your heart which you feel you need forgiveness, it's a question I ask myself, then now is the time. None of us knows what the future will hold. Now is the time, as we come to the end of our lives, to find forgiveness. So next slide, please. Finishing well is an opportunity for encouraging those who come after us. It's a great theme, isn't it, in the Bible, the way that the patriarchs, as they're approaching death, they call the family around them and they bless them. And I think this is a tradition we need to try and recover. Sadly, death and dying has become so medicalized. It's something that happens, in hospitals, behind curtains, surrounded by professionals. And yet, there's a real opportunity for us as we come to the end to encourage those who come after us, to leave some kind of spiritual legacy. And one way to do this, again, I think, is writing letters specifically to people who matter to us, just trying to express something that really matters. These things are not easy. These conversations are not easy to have. It's not easy, it's not very British to talk about our deepest emotions and feelings. But here is the opportunity for encouraging the next generation, for just talking about how God has been faithful to us, what we've learned over the years. This is a great role for older Christian people, just to pass on to the next generation, to encourage them and talk about God's faithfulness. Next slide. Finishing well is an opportunity to learn about letting go. And this is one of the hardest things, letting go of things which have meant a great deal to us. Next slide, please. This is a Christian physician, John Dunlop, and he said, "Many of the losses associated with aging are inevitable and often forced upon us, but some things we can choose to give up voluntarily. And when we can see the losses coming, I've observed that it's much better to recognize them, plan for them, and make changes somewhat gradually and proactively, rather than waiting for a crisis to force a drastic change." That's wise, isn't it? And yet, that our tendency is to hang on like grim death to everything we possibly can until finally it's stripped away from us. And sadly, then often there's some great crisis, and then everything is lost in a great crisis. How much better for us to see that actually we are being called to learn to let go. One of the very striking things in all the 4 gospel narratives is in the first part of the gospel narrative, Jesus is very active and dynamic. He's the one who calls, he's the one who acts, he's the one who heals, he's the one who goes. And in all 4 gospel narratives, there's a point at which all of a sudden it changes, and he becomes the passive one. And it's usually described as the betrayal. It happens at the betrayal, when Judas betrays him to the authorities. But actually, that's a bit of a mistranslation. The literal meaning of the Greek word, which is used repeatedly, is he was handed over. In other words, he allows himself to become passive. And this is a hard saying, but it does seem to me that Jesus has gone this way before us to teach us that there may come a time in our lives when, again, we allow ourselves to be handed over. We allow others to direct our lives. And because Christ himself has been there. In fact, as somebody has pointed out, in the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, God's glory is revealed, Jesus' glory is revealed on the Transfiguration, the Mount of Transfiguration. But interestingly, in the Gospel of John, there is no Transfiguration account. The Transfiguration doesn't come. So where is Jesus' glory most revealed in the Gospel of John? And do you know where it is? It's in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the soldiers come and they say, "Are you Jesus of Nazareth?" And he says, "I am." And they fall away. And that is the equivalent, it seems, where God's glory is revealed in Jesus, but it's as he gives himself over, as he's handed over. It's a profound mystery, but glory is revealed in dependence. Next slide. So God's plan for this age is not to abolish human suffering, but it's to redeem it. It's to bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. And I've seen that wonderful miracle happen so often. I've seen in my medical career so much loss and pain and dying babies and brain damage. And yet I've also seen wonderfully the way that God can bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. And some years ago, I had a sudden and very severe psychiatric illness. And I ended up in a locked psychiatric ward. And I was utterly dependent on the love and care of others, and I was deeply confused and ashamed and broken. I thought I'd never again work as a doctor. I'd never again have any kind of Christian ministry. And yet, amazingly, and slowly as the work of healing has taken place over years, now I look back and I see this as a strange kind of gift. That whole experience of loss and pain and confusion, actually God has used it to change me and has given me more ways of helping other people. And it's the same thing, that God actually can redeem the most evil. I've come to the conclusion there's nothing that can happen, however terrible, however apparently meaningless and catastrophic, there's nothing that can happen that God in his grace and blessing cannot transform into, can bring good from in some way. But it doesn't happen automatically. We have to hand over. We have to allow ourselves. In fact, I think the way that the glory is released is through the prayer in Gethsemane, where Jesus says, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." When we can pray that prayer, however haltingly, however painfully, when we can pray that prayer, that allows the blessing. It allows redemption to occur and the miracle to occur in our own lives. Next slide. So therefore we don't lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Next slide. And I think, as I'm coming to the close, and just to talk about this issue of dementia, I think many of us, including many Christian people, find a deep fear about dementia, about the possibility that our minds might become confused, our memories might be affected. But we need to remind ourselves that the wonderful news of the gospel is that whatever happens to me, whatever happens in the chances and the contingencies of life, whatever happens to my brain, to my conscious experiences, my thought process, my memory and so on, my personhood, or who I am, deep down, is utterly secure. Nothing can touch it. Why? Because it depends on the eternal knowledge and the covenant love of God himself. And he doesn't change. And because God knows me through and through, because he is involved with it, because God is faithful, I know that whatever will happen to me, whatever will happen to you, whatever happens to my brain, who I am, my personhood, is utterly secure. I will always be me. Next slide. I'm held secure in the unchangeable reality of God and his purposes, which stretch all the way from before the foundation of the world to the future ages of the ages. Dementia cannot quell the work of the power of God and the work of the Spirit. Next slide. And so when I'm forgetting who I am, I need you to remind me who I am and what's been important to me in my life. When I can't pray for myself, I need to know that you will pray for me. I need you to reassure me that I'm safe and that you will always love me and that you won't abandon me. One of the writers of the medieval period said this: Christ himself kisses us in the love of our friends. Christ himself kisses us in the love of our friends. And for me, when I was locked in that ward, in a psychiatric ward, if you'd come and talk to me about the love of God, to be honest, it meant absolutely nothing at all. God was a word that just had 3 letters. But the one thing that penetrated through the darkness was human love. It was the love of my wife who came and cuddled me, the love of a very close friend, even the love of John Stott, my spiritual father, who tracked me down and said, "I value your friendship, John." And that penetrated through. And it was only as I recovered later on that I was reflecting that that was God reaching out for me. Christ himself kisses us in the love of our friends. Next slide. So when we care for a person with dementia, with genuine respect and with love and compassion, we're actually pointing towards the future. We're saying this is not the end of the story. There's more going on here than you can see. We're using spiritual eyes to see beyond the physical. And that's a way we bear witness. Next slide. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul, in that great hymn to love, says, love always protects, love always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, love never fails. You know, from a human perspective, so often it seems that love does fail. We pour out our love and our compassion and our care. As a doctor, it's happened many, many times, and then it just seems to go wrong. The person dies. It's just wasted. Where's it gone? But when we're tempted to despair and to give up, the words of Paul remind us and rebuke us. Love never fails. Because in the light of eternity, love is what the theologians call an eschatological virtue. It points towards the new heaven and the new earth. And in the light of the glory that is to come, love never fails. That's what we need to remind ourselves. So I close with this next slide. I close with this verse. It's one of my favorite verses. You know, in the secular thinking, life starts from nothing. It gradually grows and it grows and it grows, and everything's getting better and everything's getting stronger, and you're learning more and more and more, and then you hit 25. And after 25, you're on the long, slow, downhill drag, and bit by bit, things are deteriorating, and your body's decaying, and your cells are dying, and your muscles are getting flabby, and you're getting diseases, and down and down and down you go, and eventually you die, and that's it. But in Christian thinking, life starts from nothing, and then it grows, and it grows, and it grows, and it's like the first gleam of dawn. Next slide. So you know what it's like? Sometimes you've been traveling through the night, and it's completely dark, and it's black, and it seems to be going on forever and ever and ever. And then out there, suddenly on the horizon, you see it. You see that first blush, that first redness, and you know, inexorably, moment by moment, the day is coming. Nothing can stop it. It's coming. And that's the analogy. We've got to live in the darkness, but we live with our eyes fixed on what we can see, the first gleam of dawn. Final slide. So hope is to hear the melody of the future, and faith is to dance to that melody in the present. Just a moment of prayer as we close. Heavenly Father, you know our hearts, you know our fragility, you know our vulnerability, you know our fears and doubts. You remember that we are dust. But we praise you for your faithfulness. We praise you for your love for us. Above all, we praise you for the Lord Jesus, who himself experienced what it was to be dependent. So help us to live in the light of the truth, and help us above all to fix our eyes on the coming age, because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. In the name of the Lord Jesus, amen.